On January 5, 1942, as the sounds of victory echoed through Tokyo, Admiral Yamamoto ordered his staff to prepare for the second phase of the Pacific War. Looking at the reports coming in from the Philippines to Malaya, it seemed almost certain that Japanese forces would control most of East Asia within a few months. Because of this, he told his Chief of Staff Matome Ugaki, "The plans will be ready by mid-February." In fact, Japan's rapid advance had surprised even the most optimistic planners in Tokyo. There was a major disagreement within the Imperial General Staff. Some thought, "Since we're winning, let's not stop," while a small group around Yamamoto was convinced that a long war would devastate Japan. This was why Yamamoto stayed constantly on. If he remained in Tokyo, he risked becoming a target of nationalists. Everyone knew Yamamoto was uncomfortable with the war expanding uncontrollably. Ugaki wrote in his diary at the time, "We need a true statesman who can see the future." This was something Yamamoto had been saying for years. Japan's chances of winning a prolonged war against countries like the US and Britain were extremely low. They openly criticized politicians, especially leaders like Prince Konoe, who had no real idea about what kind of war needed to be fought across the vast Pacific. 3 months before the war, when Yamamoto met with his close friend and nationalist leader Ryoichi Sasakawa, he expressed the bitter truth. "This is now inevitable." He continued, "At the beginning of the war, we will advance as we wish. We will spread our arms across a vast geography like an octopus." As expected, in the first days of the war, the Japanese military expanded at an unbelievable speed. But in that same meeting, Yamamoto issued another crucial warning. "This speed will one day stop. We must not miss the right moment to secure peace." For him, the right moment was when Singapore weakened. Yamamoto's caution had a simple reason. He knew the Americans and the British. He had attended the London naval conferences in 1930 and 1934, and had served in Washington between 1926 and 1928. He had seen firsthand America's industrial strength, war economy, and how quickly its people could recover. Because of this, he always repeated, "If we are to achieve a victory, it will last at most a year and a half. After that, the wind will turn." By January 5th, Japan had indeed achieved major successes. At Pearl Harbor, the U.S. battleship fleet had been neutralized. The British battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales had been sunk, Manila had fallen, and Hong Kong had surrendered. The Japanese military was rapidly advancing from Indonesia to the Solomon Islands. But one thing Yamamoto could not stop thinking about was this. The American aircraft carriers were still alive. They had failed to sink them at Pearl Harbor, and if those carriers returned one day, they could change the entire war. Because of this, Yamamoto began aiming for a much bigger blow, instead of waiting for Singapore to fall. When he objected to the Army's idea of attacking the Soviet Union, only 3 options remained. Yamamoto's first desire was an Indian Ocean operation. Taking Ceylon could cripple the British Far East Fleet, and Germany's advance into the Caucasus could secure the oil supply line, but this plan was also rejected. 2 options remained: attack Australia or attack Midway. Yamamoto found Midway more suitable because capturing Australia would take time and would not create the shock effect he wanted. Capturing Midway, however, could destroy the American carriers and allow a push toward Hawaii, or perhaps even North America. But things did not go as planned. In April, Jimmy Doolittle's surprise raid on Tokyo shocked the Japanese. Then came the Midway disaster in June. Japan lost 4 major aircraft carriers, something they could not even reveal to their own troops. Despite this huge loss of strength, Japanese commanders did not change their plans and continued operations in northern Australia. The Americans realized that the Japanese intended to push southward through New Guinea. The attack on Port Moresby was stopped in the Coral Sea, but the Japanese continued occupying surrounding islands. Meanwhile, there were also debates among American commanders. General MacArthur wanted a broad offensive. Admiral Ernest King proposed a smaller but more realistic plan. In the end, King's proposal was approved. A series of counterattacks starting from Guadalcanal. Preparations were rushed. Amphibious units were poorly trained, supplies were lacking, and there were intelligence gaps, but there was no time left. The Japanese were about to complete an airfield on Guadalcanal, and once finished, it could threaten the entire region. Fletcher did not want to risk the carriers. Turner knew the preparations were insufficient, and Vandegrift had to carry out the landing despite the inadequate training of his troops. But despite all the problems, the operation was not postponed, and the Guadalcanal campaign began. The Japanese were so focused on New Guinea that they were unaware of the threat on Guadalcanal. This gave the Americans a major early advantage. The landing at Guadalcanal was not as difficult as expected, but the naval forces faced surprises. The Japanese were truly caught off guard. Most of them were untrained and inexperienced. But things were completely different at Tulagi. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's famous Raider Battalion and the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marine Regiment encountered far tougher Japanese soldiers. The roughly 250-man Japanese force under Captain Hasuike Miyazaki consisted of experienced, determined soldiers. Edson's Raiders were the elite of the U.S. Marine Corps at the time. Only volunteers were selected, and all had undergone rigorous training. The idea of forming such a commando-like unit came from Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's observations of Chinese guerrillas fighting the Japanese. In short, when these troops arrived at Guadalcanal, they already had a reputation, and they would need the tactics they had learned. This operation was the first confrontation between American elite units and experienced Japanese troops. Since the war that began in December, Japan had won consecutive victories in the Pacific for months, and Tulagi was the first real test of that myth. On August 7th, Edson and his men reached the island's northwest. Initially, the advance seemed easy. They mainly had to deal with dense jungle, small trees, and thorny vegetation, but encountered little resistance. Still, the terrain was so difficult that covering just 1.5 miles, 2.4 kilometers, took 3 hours. When they reached the ridgeline, chaos erupted. The Marines suddenly came under fire from Japanese bunkers, rock pillboxes, and well-placed weapons. The Japanese had arranged their defensive positions so that every firing point protected another to advance. Americans had to climb cliffs and destroy the bunkers with grenades and explosives. In one bunker, 17 Japanese were killed, but 2 Japanese soldiers who were still alive killed the 2 American soldiers who entered. The situation was the same for the teams moving along the ridge. One company suffered 15% casualties on the first day. Snipers were everywhere, in trees, on rooftops, behind rocks. One tactic was especially dangerous. Japanese snipers would fire on units behind the front line after letting the first American wave pass. This usually ended with the sniper's death, but not without American losses. In the afternoon, the Marines reached a valley resembling a ruined English cricket field. Surrounded by slopes, the Japanese had turned it into a deadly defensive zone. Under heavy fire, the Marines were forced to halt once night fell. At night, the Americans encountered a new Japanese tactic: desperate nighttime assaults. The Japanese knew they wouldn't survive until morning, so they attacked to the death. At 22:30, they broke between 2 American companies and encircled one. Close quarters fighting with knives, grenades, and machine guns broke out. The Japanese got close to Edson's command post. The Americans repelled the attack but suffered heavy losses. Half of a company's non-commissioned officers were killed. The next day, 7,500 American troops had landed on Tulagi. The Marines pushed toward the southeast of the island. Japanese bunkers were being destroyed, and some caves contained both decomposed and freshly killed Japanese bodies. These scenes taught the Americans this: Japanese soldiers considered it their duty to fight until they received a retreat order. That day, the Americans saw Japan's fight-to-the-death culture more clearly. 3 Japanese officers cornered in a bunker used their last bullets to commit suicide. This initially shocked the Americans. But after several incidents where Japanese soldiers pretended to surrender and then attacked, the Marines realized they would not give up. From that point on, they stopped trying to convince Japanese troops to surrender. Tulagi was captured in 2 days, but hidden Japanese snipers continued to harass the Americans for days. The fights on Gavutu and Tanambogo were even worse than Tulagi. On these 2 islands, Japanese forces had built strong fortifications to protect the seaplane base, and the Americans encountered a defense they had not expected. The first landing wave took little fire, but the second and third waves walked into a brutal inferno. The Japanese placed levers under tanks, threw grenades, and attempted to burn the tanks using gasoline-soaked cloth. One commander opened the tank hatch and killed 23 Japanese with a machine gun, but a Japanese soldier climbed onto the tank and killed him with a bayonet. Another Japanese soldier set the tank on fire from the inside. Reinforcements were requested, but due to confusion in the darkness, units landed in the wrong places. One group of Marines was trapped on the beach, with only a concrete pier serving as cover. The Japanese saw them and opened fire. Many Marines were killed on the shore. The fighting continued through the night, and by 4 a.m. on August 8th, the passage was secured. Around 500 Japanese soldiers on Gavutu and Tanambogo were killed. Meanwhile, the Japanese command at Rabaul learned that Tulagi had fallen and sent all their aircraft to the region. The air battles that began in the afternoon were intense. The Americans shot down most of the bombers, but Zero fighters remained a deadly threat. SVEE-4. Wildcats were slower and less maneuverable than Zeros, but they were sturdier, and the pilots were learning how to use them tactically. On August 8th, the Japanese sent another 45 dive bombers. American aircraft shot down most of them, but the transport ship George F. Elliott and the destroyer Jarvis suffered heavy damage. That same day, American pilots launched operations against Japanese positions on Guadalcanal. Japanese torpedo bombers flying low over the sea were detected, and the Americans attacked them.